Okay, here we go. So again, welcome everyone for joining. I'm Erica Bierbauer. I am your host and Colorado chapter lead. I'm a clinical pharmacist with a passion and interest in healthcare and technology. Thanks for joining. We have an exciting presentation today. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about what blockchain in healthcare today is. We are the first peer-reviewed journal that talks about blockchain in healthcare. It's a great place to get education and find out more about blockchain and other technologies in healthcare, information systems, and the biomedical sciences sector. We're an online-only open access journal. We have a large editorial board. We have all types of publications. So if you go to our website, you can find out what's going on in the space. And really we have everything from beginners in blockchain to novice. So you can learn a lot about what's going on in blockchain healthcare today. And the submissions and publications are actually tracked with blockchain via the Artifacts Research Portal, as you can see down here. So if you are to submit a paper, you can actually see each step of that in the literature review process. And the subscription to the journal is complimentary. I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat later so you can subscribe and keep up to date on what's going on in the space. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide describing all of the different topics that we cover with the journal. We have use cases such as supply chains and management. As we know, that's been really disrupted with the pandemic. So you can learn more about how blockchain and other technologies are helping out with the problems that have been happening. We also have special reports with things like pandemic core challenges and opportunities with distributed ledger technology. We have models for trust, including zero knowledge proofs and data privacy. You can read through the other ones here. New business models such as value-based health economics, incentive models, other things like that. We cover health information technology, electronic health records, medical devices, and clinical trials. Clinical trials have been a huge hot topic with blockchain technology. So you can learn a lot about that. And of course, legal, regulatory, governance, and ethics. Can't have anything without looking at that kind of thing, especially with new technology in healthcare. Education, and in addition, we also have a blog. So if you're not, interested in writing or reading about primary research articles, you can look at our blog section where authors can share experiences and reflections. So really, we're putting this out there to get people to come to the site and get educated more on blockchain and other technologies in healthcare. And we're also looking for people, if you're interested in writing a paper, that's also something that would be great because we are seeking indexing in PubMed in the first quarter of 2022. So that will be really exciting when we get on PubMed, and we'll get a lot more exposure. Next slide, please. So the Colorado chapter, I'm the ambassador, and we're going to be hosting these meetings quarterly. We have a LinkedIn chapter page here where you can get information on when our next chapter meetings are. We're going to start meeting quarterly, as I said, and have some really exciting speakers and presentations. We have a chapter page on the Blockchain and Healthcare Today website. And on this page, you'll find this presentation. It will be recorded and available on that page, as well as past presentations. And there are chapters all over the US and all over the world. And really our goal is to educate and unite healthcare stakeholders, clinicians, and really anyone interested in healthcare and converging technologies, because things are changing really fast and we need to keep up to date on all of the changes with technology. There's a lot going on, and it's important for us to collaborate on where we see this going in the future. For healthcare stakeholders, for clinicians, and really anyone interested is our community. And we are sponsored by BurstIQ. We're extremely grateful and happy to be sponsored by them. They're really holding the torch and blazing the field for blockchain and healthcare and other technologies going forward and developing a community here in Colorado. And we have a very exciting presentation today. We have Frank Ricotta, the CEO and founder of BurstIQ, and he will be presenting on Metaverse and the convergence of this tech with blockchain and other technologies and its applicability in the healthcare sector. And so without taking any more time up, I will pass it over to Frank for the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. We will be taking questions in the chat and going over those at the end.
Well, first of all, thanks, Erica, and thanks for leading the chapter. BHTY is doing a lot of great things. I mean, I love reading a lot of the articles, especially the fact that they're peer-reviewed. Excuse me. And they just have a lot of great information within the journal. So, excuse me, and thanks again for leading. Okay, let's get into a fun topic, which is the metaverse. I mean, it's a pretty popular topic today for a lot of reasons, many of which you all are aware of in terms of Facebook changing their name. But let's just start out with the basics in terms of what is the metaverse and why should you care? So over the last 18 months, one of the things that has emerged, from this COVID era is that, we've accelerated 7 to 10 years in this whole digital transformation adoption. And this number, I've had this validated, from large CRM companies to smaller companies in terms of how things have evolved and how things have evolved quickly. And just in the health space, we've seen this in the form of how common now telehealth and telemedicine has become. The fact is we're all Zoomies now as well on the work side of life, and the nature of work has changed. And again, it's pretty comfortable for us to have a clinical interaction over a video conference. And so, and really illustrating this fact as well is the notion that we've all heard the term metaverse at this point in time. And if you think back about a year and a half, it wasn't a very common phrase. But what exactly is the metaverse? Well, there really isn't one common definition. In fact, it's only recently that it emerged as the most popular term to describe what we're going to talk about today, versus omniverse or multiverse. And so it really has dominated the conversation. And the way I like to think about it is that it's our physical and our virtual worlds colliding, and everything about the internet and AI all kind of rolled up into one. And the boundary between kind of a person and machine really begins to blur. As a bit of history, metaverse, the term metaverse, you're going to inevitably find it in Neil Stephenson's novel for the first time. He coined it in Snow Crash back in 1992. But the whole concept around this kind of these virtual spaces and virtual environments, and you could trace that back to the 1950s with sensory theaters and some gaming environments since then. A good example is LucasArts Maze War, as well as others. So again, it's been around for a while. The concept's been around for a while. And I'm going to point out one quote up in the upper right is Matthew Ball. He's got a great 9-part metaverse primer. Matthew Ball is a venture capitalist, but the 9-part primer is excellent. I would suggest you read it. And more recently, we've had things like Ready Player One, and I'm going to throw the Matrix into the bucket. But what I find very interesting about all this is when the sci-fi novels and writers start to dive into the topic, it's usually this dystopian environment. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of, is that really where we're headed, or is it really going to be a technology that benefits society? So again, the metaverse, it's nowhere and it's everywhere. And the fact is, we're already in it. Yes, we live in the real world, or some people would say they really don't. And some people say, I really don't at times. But yes, there's the real world. And there's now a reemergence of augmented reality. Ray-Ban just announced, their set of glasses. We're going to talk a little bit about the privacy concerns there. But, augmented reality is, as we function in the real world, there's a virtual overlay. And we've seen this both on the gaming side with Pokemon Go, but now also in more of a kind of a real world situation, with think of a heads-up display in these glasses. And finally, there's virtual reality, which is a total immersion. I mean, you're in the world kind of virtually. You have a virtual presence in that world. You're interacting with other virtual characters, our personas, our people, our AIs. But again, it's really more of an immersion. The technology is still relatively young. We have these kind of virtual reality goggles that we could put on, and are we ever going to get to the place of, as I mentioned, Ready Player One, where we have full body suits and full sensory perception? I'm not sure. I think eventually we'll get there. But the fact is that we're seeing more and more kind of real world examples where virtual reality has extended beyond the gaming space. Okay, the parts. I think it's important to talk about the parts here in terms of what really makes up the metaverse. There's the aspect of what makes it work and what you see. In terms of what makes it work, it's hardware, it's software, it's network, and really kind of this mobile infrastructure, and particularly as we get to 5G and beyond, it's the cloud. It's a set of services that people provide, software development service to augment some of these virtual environments, and other types of services. And I'm adding blockchain because I think blockchain is going to be pretty important to broader scale adoption of the metaverse. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. In terms of what you see, the three big ones from my perspective, and we're going to dive into these a little more in depth, is community, the economies associated with it, as well as identity. But what also is key here is the fact that there's places associated with the metaverse, and it takes people to really make the metaverse a reality. So I'm going to talk about communities first. What's the now? The now is really all our social media platforms, and the fact is, again, as I say, we're already operating in the metaverse. Each of us has a persona that we present up on social media. We have our Facebook persona, we have our work persona on LinkedIn, as well as others, and we kind of immerse. We expose what we think we want people to see about us. Even though our actions and behaviors are mined and monetized, we think we're controlling what we're presenting to the rest of the world and who we're interacting with. The new, if you have a teenager, they're going to hang out in one of these gaming environments and spend a lot of time in there. It's not just to play the game, it's their form of community. They get online and immerse themselves in these games to socialize, and to be a part of something. I mean, they connect with their friends, they meet new people, and of course, they're immersed in these virtual world. The next is where potentially we're plugged in all the time, or really have this full immersion. Some would say it's an augmented human state. Think Elon Musk and Neuralink. But the metaverse is with us all the time, no matter what we're doing. There's not a lot of distinction between our real selves and our virtual selves and our virtual personas that we present in all these different worlds and these different environments. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get through the presentation. Of course, I don't think we can talk about the metaverse without hitting Meta, given the recent announcement. This is actually directly from their website, with the exception of I put the logo on the moon. So a little bit of creative editing. But Facebook has made a pretty bold statement that they're going to be a metaverse company. And how did they really get here? If you take a step back, they're not just jumping off from what we all know as Facebook into the metaverse. There's been they've had over 90 acquisitions over the last 15 years. I put a list of the top 6 up here. And so the key ones, I think, are the first 3, which are WhatsApp, which gives really kind of a secure communication, voice and video and text. Oculus, obviously on the VR side of life, and Instagram, which really significantly expanded their social footprint. But, Facebook isn't the only one pushing on this whole concept of metaverse. Microsoft announced they're going to begin to incorporate a lot of these capabilities within teams. So they're coming at it from a business perspective. And of course, I'm sure there's going to be kind of a push on the gaming station side of life with Xbox. And both Apple and Google all have a strategy within this space in terms of how they play. You know, here's the big thing in terms of understanding how big tech is stepping into this. You know, the real question is, do we trust them to really manage these spaces? Trust them with all our data. Trust them with another level of managing who we are, kind of in the cyberspace. You know, I think you know, one has a right to question: is it too much power in the hands of so few? And I'm probably on the side that's saying yes. But the good news is that it's going to take years for the metaverse to evolve. And I don't think one company is going to own it in and of themselves. And I think I'm in good company there with Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to have a big share. I mean, they got a lot of money, they got a lot of tech, they have a lot of presence and connections to people. But I do think it's going to be much broader than any one single company. And I also believe that emerging technologies like blockchain are going to change the whole governance structure of how we manage even our own data and our own personas in these online environments. And I'm very bullish on the fact that it really puts the power back in our hands to own and control our data, to own and control our identity and our personas as we present themselves in these virtual worlds. The economics. If you look at all these gaming environments, there's a ton of economics within these environments in terms of there's in-game purchases. As I mentioned, service providers are providing services like virtual clothing, virtual skins, in a way that has created a multi-billion-dollar in-game type economy. And in fact, on a broader basis, what we're going to see, the broader market for metaverse reach close to $1 trillion by the end of this decade. You know, when you look at all the parts, you know, the hardware as well as the software, as well as the in-game virtual environments. But again, what's key is you have communities, you have economies or in-game currencies that you're able to transact with. And now we're starting to see these type of currencies extend beyond the gaming space and into the real world, or the real virtual world, in the form of NFTs. You know, it allows you to own, for instance, own your given avatar or character or items within the virtual space in a way that's demonstrable outside the game, and potentially transferable and transactionable outside the game. And even think about these kind of in-game purchases where people are spending quite a bit of money for virtual real estate, and not just kind of attire for one's own character. So there's lots of things happening within these frameworks that transition to real economic value and real economic transactions. And NFTs as a term, in non-fungible tokens on the blockchain side of life, are going to play a big part in transitioning between a given metaverse world and into a broader set of transaction and ownerships. The other side of life, the cryptocurrencies. You know, cryptocurrencies and blockchains are an awesome payment rail. So I think what you're going to see over time is these common payment rails that end up being cryptocurrencies that in and of themselves are traded outside of any given metaverse in more of a common way. And we're going to need these two things to happen if metaverse and metaverse concepts are going to extend beyond the gaming space. So again, it's really kind of blurring that distinction between the virtual side of life and the real world side of life, in terms of kind of transactions and ownerships, and even simple things like, hey, you bought this jacket in the metaverse. Do you want to see what it looks like on you in real life? And would you like to buy it? And so we see a lot of brands figuring out how to jump in the metaverse as a marketing concept, which is going to be a lot different than what we see today. and from a sales perspective in terms of being part of the environment and not just trying directly to sell you something. So if you're building a company and you have any kind of direct to person marketing and sales, I think you got to spin yourself up on how you might do that in the metaverse. And same goes for kind of B2B transactions. The other thing I kind of want to point out, I skipped a little bit on community, is we're seeing these communities again transition out of the virtual spaces into kind of these overlaps. For instance, in some of the environments, they've held live conferences and live concerts and events as kind of a means to connect with a specific community or a community of interest. And, to do that, you got to extend it out into the economics as well. Jump into identity. So let's just start with avatars, be it a fixed avatar on how you want to present who you are within a given environment, to a full kind of digital persona. The reality in today's world, we create our avatars for these spaces, variations of ourselves, or, hey, in this environment, I may want to be a fireman or an ogre or a troll or an elf or a fairy or whatever it happens to be. I'm able to do that and to kind of own who I am in those spaces. And again, back to the economies, I'm able now to create something unique or use a unique piece of art that I now own as a way to represent myself in these various environments. But what we find in today's world, there's not a lot of overlap, between, for instance, the three gaming environments. You have your own distinct personas in each, and I'm going to say the same as even on our social platforms. But over time, we're going to have the ability to control what part of ourselves we present and in what way, in a way that transcends different aspects of the metaverse, and in a way that we own these things. Which leads me kind of the next point of identity. If you've been on any of our previous knowledge bursts, we talk a lot about this transition or this emergence of one's digital self, starting with just data about you. Until recently, most of us didn't care what our online data consisted of. We were happy to use Google search engine, we were happy to jump on Facebook and connect with friends and family, we're happy to jump on Instagram and share our photos and stories. All the while kind of providing access to data about us, and really kind of fueling kind of this big tech monopoly and this big tech business model of really influencing human behavior and monetizing it. And what we're advocating for as we move forward is that balance of power begins to shift, as we see the emergence of our digital self, or how we represent ourselves in these virtual spaces, and even transitioning into this whole concept of ambient twins, which is in essence not just a virtual representation of us, but we're starting to see kind of AI built into our virtual selves, so they have a level of autonomy to do things on our behalf. And again, I think we're at the verge of this, of us having aspects of this in our daily lives over the next couple of years. The view of us having a full AI twin, I think is quite a number of years off. Just like I think general AI is still quite a ways off. But we're progressing down that path, and the real issue is where is that balance of power, and who's going to own your digital self? From a health and healthcare perspective, I think we see a lot of what's emerging in the metaverse, taking vision into reality. I mean, here's one example. In the health space, we've talked quite often about remote specialty assistance, where a surgeon a couple thousand miles away could actually perform surgery on a patient through a virtual environment with the assistance of of a machine or kind of a robot, for lack of better words, on the other side, or an attending physician on the other side. The metaverse and convergence of all these technologies that we talked about earlier is going to make that more prevalent, which is really pretty cool from a broader perspective, because what's the outcome? We're increasing access, not just for specialty kind of practices, but in general. We're pushing that access boundary out closer and closer to where a person lives their life on a day in and day out basis, which kind of drives into a whole new set of engagement models. So, at BurstIQ, we're seeing this emergence of what we've called edge therapeutics and edge diagnostics that allow some pretty advanced testing to occur, say, within a person's home or with their family, and make that engagement more meaningful. We definitely, again, are comfortable with telehealth and telemedicine, but as we transition into our digital selves, what we're going to see is that gamification of that engagement model. My digital self might start turning into my health buddy and remind me to take my meds to increase my compliance. All these IoT devices around are going to give me a lot more fidelity in what's going on with me, which then makes the engagement with my care providers a lot more meaningful. And let's not shortchange just the health and wellness side of life. Peloton, for example, pioneered creating community and engagement in not just another exercise device. And we're just going to see more and more of this kind of emerge, both in an augmented reality space as well as a full virtual reality space. The other aspect is immersion and learning. Immersion from the standpoint of really allowing someone to learn in more of a hands-on environment around situations you're not going to see each and every day, like emergency situations. We already do this in other industries. For instance, pilots spend a lot of time in simulators, and a lot of these simulators are full immersion simulators, with motion and 360-degree sensory inputs, and they're able to deal with, I lost an engine, or I lost all my engine, or some other emergency in a way that makes them more effective and prepared in real life. And I think we're going to see that for our health professionals, and to some extent, we're seeing the early stages of that in Second Life, where there's a whole spot in Second Life where you can go and learn and explore and be exposed to different aspects of health and health situations, and definitely see this from a higher ed perspective as well. Community, again, more chances to form different communities. I talked about Peloton on the health and wellness side of life. But it also is going to allow us to come together as humans in different ways, both professionally and personally. I think it's a whole nother level in interacting with patients like me in crowd intelligence and potentially crowd diagnostics. I think we're going to see just this whole new emergence of some really cool community and community-oriented services. And then I think tactically and near term, it can have a pretty substantial impact on the therapy side of life, particularly with those suffering from mental health conditions, and in a way to expose them to situations that are safe and protected and clinical to help them cope and help them deal with those situations. But also, again, also transitioning into somebody in the physical therapy side of life. So, we know companies that are leveraging, for example, the LiDAR and infrared technologies within an Xbox to measure somebody's mobility and motion, to determine progressions of conditions such as MS and others. So again, you're going to see kind of this crossover to where these technologies that watch us, that we interact with, begin to help us live a better and healthier life. The next thing, and somewhat of the holy grail on the health side of life, is really helping each and everyone have our own personal health journey, both in real life and interacting with all the virtual me's and virtual encounters that we're able to deal with along our pathing. I mentioned some about having my own health buddy, but this is where I also think you'll see some growth on the AI side of life in terms of helping set my health pathway in a way that's unique and customized to me. And it's going to be a convergence of not only AI, but all these really cool precision medicine technologies that are beginning to emerge to allow things to be customized to each and every one of us as an individual, and not just for those who are economically well off to afford it, but really extending that kind of service, hopefully, to everyone on the planet. Okay, some of the downsides, and I want to hit two of them, and we could spend a whole hour just on these downsides, on potential downsides here. And that I want to hit one first on mental health, and mental health does matter. I talked about the potential positive side of this when it comes to therapy and mental health engagement. But when we're dealing with these broad metaverses and concepts, they're not clinical environments, they're not controlled environments, and they have a tendency to potentially, for some personality types, lead to addiction, lead to kind of magnification of some personality disorders like schizophrenia and others. And I think we're just learning what the consequences are of living in these virtual spaces for extended period of times, and what that means for our own mental health. Both Peter Thiel, who talks about, we're still a ways off from artificial general intelligence, and what that means for us as humans, as well as Eric Smith, in some ways have both commented on it. Eric Smith said, he's not sure whether the metaverse is good for humanity. And again, go back and think about all these sci-fi novels and writers that all leads to some dystopian environment. And is that really where this is going to take us, where kind of big tech's going to be able to influence us in such a way that we're not really our own people anymore? So I think it's really pretty important to understand both the positives and the negative side of mental health and what these kind of environments will do to us. The other is data and privacy. And I'm a big fan, and the UN has added this as their 31st right, is that you should own your own data, and not only own your own data as our data drives kind of online personas and online AI. The fact that our rights as individuals should begin to extend into these virtual spaces. I think there's a lot of work regulatory wise to make this happen, both from that perspective as well as privacy. So think about augmented reality, and I have my augmented reality glasses on, and I'm looking around the room, and it's doing facial recognition, so I know who I'm interacting with in a given room, or who's walking down the street going the other way, whether I know them or not. It's collecting all this data. Where does that data go? And now I'm collecting data about you, and not just about me. And what are my rights to that data? And where do we draw that line between convenience for us as an individual to encroaching on others' privacy and their own personal space? Again, a lot of work to go there, and not to mention is overall use of that data and how that data can be used and in what context. I think that's one of the biggest questions that collectively, both as individuals and as an industry, we're going to have to deal with in the very near term. So blockchain, I can't get through a presentation again without, I had to talk about meta, in a metaverse presentation, but we have to talk about blockchain, and blockchain, not just as a technology, but more as a way of doing things in the philosophy, and using cryptography to instantiate trust. Trust is really, really important. And what we're talking about here is the ability is really the difference between centralized trust, placing our trust in a company like Facebook. And by the way, they'll always be Facebook to me, just like Alphabet is always Google to me. But putting our trust in those kind of companies, or even a government, versus kind of a decentralized trust where we're all part of that overall governance and how things work in these virtual spaces. I like the latter. And I think it's blockchain that provides the foundation to make that a reality, that where we truly have a distributed autonomous organization and governance within the metaverse. So last, my shameless plug on BurstIQ and what we're doing. Think of us as really kind of building the environment for you to manage your data, not just within the metaverse, but within all aspects of your life, and really giving you the ability to own and control it and interact with it in a secure kind of distributed network, what we call LifeCraft networks. And for us, it's really important, to allow kind of the data owners themselves and people who own their virtual personas over time to own and control and consent to how their virtual selves are used, and data about themselves are used in things like the metaverse. And finally, all this should be used to drive just experiences for your life, be it health, learning, career, and of course, entertainment in a very intelligent way. So I'll leave you with this question, as we're walking down this path of metaverses, which also to me include kind of pathing down, which includes a pathing to augmented people. When is a person not a person? It's a very philosophical question, and how, in terms of how we deal with it. But I love this quote from Morpheus in the Matrix: "What is real?" Our brain is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But in some ways, it's hard for us to distinguish between real and virtual in terms of how we perceive a lot of things and what gets imprinted on ourselves. And with that, I think that wraps it up.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank. I learned so much. I'm still wrapping my head around the metaverse and what it's going to look like in everyday life and healthcare and data. So now we'll go ahead and open up the floor to any questions. We do have a few in the chat, but I wanted to see if anyone wanted to ask Frank anything directly.
So, well, let's look in the chat.
Yeah.
Enterprise ownership runs counter to the decentralized tenet of blockchain. I think there's a lot of truth to that, from the standpoint of, when we're dealing with this whole concept of data scarcity, owning and controlling data becomes something of value. We're in this transition, as I mentioned earlier, of data abundance. And when we're in data abundance, it's more about understanding that data. And yes, enterprises are going to play a big role in trying to co-opt a lot of that data to increase the value of their enterprise, or how they deal with a person, if it's a B2B to C, or B2B, as we like to say, B2B to H, B2B to human type environment. But we can balance the scales. We can balance the scales to give a little more power back to the individual, in terms of data about themselves. But the fact is, there's a lot of data that's enterprise centric, and they themselves are data owners, and they don't live in a vacuum. They got to interact with other enterprises as well. So this whole kind of data security, data provenance, in terms of understanding data and its origin, and building kind of smart data in terms of security and ownership, I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's going to enable the next kind of generation of businesses and enterprises. But that's a great question.
We have another one down from Leanne about, what do you think about NFTs being used for social impact, specifically in healthcare?
Say that one again.
What do you think about NFTs being used for social impact, specifically in healthcare?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities there. We're working on a couple projects now that really potentially cross over what is a pretty hot NFT market around art, which is really where it's taken hold, and how that transitions from using kind of NFT constructs, as a potential funding mechanism for social impact projects, and beyond, in terms of how that might work. And so stay tuned. You're going to hear more from us on that particular topic over the next couple months. But I think there's a lot that can happen in that with NFTs and social impact.
We have a few questions in the Q&A, one from Wendy. How can healthcare information be protected in the metaverse? And the next question kind of ties into that. How will compliance be incorporated into the metaverse?
Yeah. Hey, Erica, can you repeat that? It broke up a little bit for me.
Oh, sorry about that. Wendy asked, how can healthcare information be protected in the metaverse? And then there's a related question from Talisha, how will compliance be incorporated into the metaverse?
Yeah, I think two great questions. In terms of protection and security, it really all starts at fundamentally the data level, and it works itself up. So we have a whole concept of BurstIQ called smart data, where we build both context and trust within the data object itself. So, think of those security elements wrapped around the data, and then on the other side, kind of a whole consenting structure, sort of a lock and key that I'm able to use that data in a given way, or I'm permissioning that data to be used in a given way. So we're big fans of data itself becoming smarter, both for people interactions as well as AI and machine intelligence interactions. As for compliance, I think that's a huge question that we have to address in terms of how you enforce compliance in these spaces. Just like how do we enforce this whole notion of GDPR? I mean, there's a lot of good regulatory framework there, but how then is that enforced, and how do I know if my rights are being violated in any way or not? I think in some respects, there'll be a lot of similarities, in the real world of compliance and regulatory guidance as we transition into our virtual equivalents, in terms of saying, hey, this is a health interaction with my doctor, and as such, it has different rules associated with it in the metaverse than if I was playing in Minecraft or Fortnite or something else.
Yeah, those are great questions. I was kind of wondering myself, what is going to drive our participation in the governance of the metaverse versus companies, and how we'll really be able to control our own data with all these big companies out there. Do we have another question from Christian? How does blockchain enable the metaverse in a way that legacy IT does not?
I mean, that's another great question. So again, you got to think of this notion of centralized versus decentralized. What I love about blockchain, it's a win-win kind of environment. The more people play in the infrastructure, the more people participate, the stronger the security becomes of those environments, and the more people benefit. It's not a win versus lose kind of space. Everybody has a set of shared incentives within these environments. The other aspect, if you look at the fundamental constructs, what are the fundamental constructs? It's based on kind of these whole zero knowledge proofs. Is I don't know who you are, but based on the mechanics of how blockchain work, I can trust that you're a valid participant in a transaction that's about to occur. I mean, let's go straight to cryptocurrency. Does Christian own Bitcoin? Yes, Christian owns Bitcoin. Does he have the right to transfer that Bitcoin or sell that Bitcoin to Frank? Yes, he does. And the network then facilitates that transfer and validates that transfer. So it's a one thing. There's no double spend, or no double transactions, and no fraudulent missteps in that transaction. The other aspect is I love the fact that in blockchain ecosystems that you can create a whole framework around distributed governance or distributed autonomous organizations. Whether you're setting up a whole governance layer with people to participate based on their ownership in the network or their transaction stake in the network, you can set it at a level, you can set it down to zero, that they have the ability to influence how the network or how the environment operates. And so we're taking power out of it's not one company, operating an environment. It really is the people who have stakes and stakes within that environment then have a voice. I look at it from this perspective. Without diving into politics, blockchain is very libertarian. It pushes rights and privileges out to the least among us that allows them to participate within an environment. And I think that's what it's going to enable in the metaverse versus a Facebook owning and controlling all the worlds and all the environments and the rules in which we conduct ourselves and what information I can consume and what type of interactions I can have within a given space. It really moves that out to the community, which I love about blockchain.
Great. We have a couple more questions in the chat. Please elaborate more regarding making NFTs of components of the user digital twin.
Sure. So, it starts with the fundamental concept of what an NFT is, non-fungible token. It represents something unique, and it's something, it represents what that value is as something unique, whether it's a virtual asset or a real asset. And so, when we're in the digital world, there are going to be things that are unique to us, and some of it could be our own data. Some of it might be an item that I own that I might want to transact with in a virtual space. I mentioned the whole concept of virtual real estate. I may own the Denver Capitol in a metaverse, and somebody wants to buy it from me. And we've seen some of these things really increase in value, even though there's no real ownership in a real tangible thing. Conversely, NFTs also can represent ownership in something tangible in our space. So it's a good way to represent kind of ownership of something of value, no matter how much the value of that particular asset, and something that's actually unique. And I think it's going to become part of our currency in that space.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The next question going on the line here, there's quite a few comments, but I'm sticking to the questions. How do you see private insurance reimbursement changing with the introduction of care through the metaverse? Well, that's a good one.
Kind of love that one. How did it change in terms of paying for telehealth and telemedicine visits? There were a lot of payers that simply wouldn't reimburse you for those kind of engagements, and now every payer has a service or will point you to a service where that's okay. And that really happened in the last 18 months. There was a lot of pushback on that being part of somebody's benefit package on a broader sense, and we got over that pretty quick in the early stages of COVID. So I don't see that really changing in terms of reimbursement models. What I do see changing is that we're going to move from this encounter model, like I need to see the doc because I'm sick, to really kind of a broader engagement model. And what does that really mean? Engagement and outcomes in these reimbursement models. And if metaverse type technology and engagement technologies help me live a more productive and healthier life, all the better. And I'm going to say you're going to see payers embrace that, because at the end of the day, they, like big tech, want to influence and monetize human behavior, but in a different way. It's to their benefit to find a way to keep us healthy versus having to deal with pain when we're sick and we have issues. So I think the reimbursement mechanism might, what currencies will that be, and what conversion currencies will that take? Will it be something that's more cryptocurrency oriented or just same in the real world fiat based? I think that remains to be seen. I think we got a lot to go in the financial side of this and the payment rail side of this before we can determine what that's going to look like.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot to be seen. Great answer. So the next one is from Elizabeth. Is blockchain subject to workplace mobbing like any other commons?
Say that again.
Is blockchain subject to workplace mobbing like any other commons?
Did you say workplace mobbing? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
mobbing. It's mobbing.
Okay, you got me on that one.
I'm trying to figure that one out too. I don't know if Elizabeth wants to comment more on that.
Yeah, kind of tell me what you mean by that, in terms of mobbing. I mean, on one aspect in this may not be what you mean is, is there bullying, in the virtual side of life? Yes. Is there intimidation? Yes. But conversely, is there a way to, pull together a team to solve a given project, no matter where that team lives and works, in a more efficient and optimal way? Yeah, I think that's the case.
It looks like she's talking about group bullying.
Yeah. Is it easy? I think it's going to be easier doing virtual space because more people can jump in. We already see it on the social platforms, right? People jumping in and being overly aggressive and belligerent to someone because they disagree with what they said or posted. And I think that's going to be up to the broader community to control and to really deal with. But it's one of the negative sides. I think I think it's going to amplify what we see on social platforms, or can amplify what we see on social platforms without the right kind of governance structures in place.
Okay, we have about 4 minutes and we have 2 more questions. Thanks for all the engagement, everybody. Nathan asked, do you see the healthcare companies moving patient records to blockchain?
Do I? Not directly. I mean, you have to look at blockchain and the evolution of blockchain, similar to the internet technologies, 20 plus years ago, where, infrastructure technologies built a lot of capabilities, to eventually, in one aspect, culminate in the World Wide Web and, distributed publishing, right? Democratizing publishing and content. So blockchain has a lot of really good feature sets, and blockchain methods have a lot of really good feature sets to be able to do that. But you're not going to see healthcare records directly on a ledger as we know it today, because they don't go away. Ledgers are permanent. So you're going to see the emergence of smart services, at the data and data sharing ledger. But and I'm going to plug us a little bit. I'm sorry. Similar to what we do is we incorporate blockchain methods to sign in and test data to create these smart data objects. You're going to see more of those services emerge that in essence augment the ledger, but still provide those same kind of capabilities and extend up into smart contract structures for consent and data sharing and data usage. So I eventually see it in some construct like that, but not directly on a ledger.
Yeah, I agree. Last question from Elizabeth. Is there a way to protect node operators who call out an invalid transfer?
That's a great question. I think the answer is yes and no. And why I say yes and no. And yes, from the standpoint of how you structure the overall governance of an environment and what that means when you have somebody that dissents. If it's just straight at the protocol level, the blockchain protocol level, whether it's at, being used at a layer 1 kind of utility network, or as we use it in a layer 2 type service, a lot of the consensus mechanisms have their own methods for determining what's accurate and what's not accurate, and what's an invalid answer versus a valid answer. So there's a lot of those checks and balances just within the cryptographic methods. But when you're talking about really an invalid transaction that was more at the conceptual level, where it actually transacted within the system validly, right? So it's something that I didn't mean to do, but I did it anyway, and it transacted back, and I need to reverse transaction that. I think that becomes part of an overall governance method and how you deal with that at more of a fundamental kind of business problem level.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, Frank, for the engaging presentation, and everyone for their questions and attendance and participation. That was awesome. And does anyone have any closing comments before I close out the meeting?
One, I want to thank everybody for staying on. So appreciate that. And hopefully you learned a little something. Feel free to send me comments, directly, either on LinkedIn or you send them to me at BurstIQ. Love to hear from you. And hopefully it was worthwhile. And we'll pick a couple of these topics going forward and drive a little deeper to where we can explore some aspects in a lot more depth.
Yeah, and to Christian, yes, as Frank just said, you can reach out on LinkedIn for the unanswered questions. Sorry, we weren't able to get to every single one of them, but thank you everyone for your attendance. And also feel free to reach out to me on any questions on BHTY and subscription and the community that we're creating in Colorado. Thank you, Frank, for the presentation, and BurstIQ for sponsoring BHTY. We'll be meeting again in Q1 of 2022, and I'll be sending out information on that very soon.
So my last comment, everybody needs to go join BHTY. You will enjoy the content, and it's a fun community when we all get together.
Yeah, and we can't wait to meet in person again too. That will be happening at some point.